Zodiac's first cipher, Z408, was solved within a few days once it appeared in Bay Area newspapers in August of 1969. Donald and Betty Hardin made history by beating the authorities to the solution. Check out episode 3 of this series for a deep dive into that cipher. How did they solve it? Information about their approach came from newspaper articles at the time, as well as Graysmith's book years later. There are a few details in the Vallejo police reports too. My understanding of their story was that Donald had an interest in code breaking since his childhood, and knew about basic code breaking techniques such as frequency analysis. And Betty had intuitions about what she thought the killer would talk about in his encrypted message. They both looked for patterns together, and used trial and error to figure out what the message was. Betty was tenacious, and evidently stayed up all night working on it while Donald slept. In this interview from 1998, Donald talked about the words they thought would be in the message.
And the major thing was that we felt that the word kill or killing would appear in his code, and the word I, because he had an ego.
But I haven't seen much more detail than that about how they solved it. Until now. In October, my cryptanalysis friend Bill Breyer alerted me to the existence of a letter Donald Hardin wrote to David Kahn, the esteemed historian and author of The Codebreakers, The Story of Secret Writing. That book is considered to be an ultimate reference about the history of cryptography. Apparently, Kahn wrote a letter to the Hardens expressing an interest in how they solved the Zodiac cipher. Donald Hardin's letters to David Kahn can be found at the National Cryptologic Museum. Bill worked with their librarian, Rob Simpson, to get a copy of the letters. Rob said the letters were donated by David Kahn to the museum in the mid-2000s as part of his very extensive research collection. They offer a rare and unique glimpse into the minds of the Hardens as they worked on solving the Zodiac Killer's first cryptograms. You can view and read the letters yourself. The links are in the video description. The first letter is from February 5th, 1970. In it, Donald referred to David Kahn's letter to him from a few days prior, where he expressed an interest in how Donald and Betty solved the Zodiac cipher. I think Kahn might have been researching the cryptography aspects of the Zodiac case. Maybe he wanted to include it in a future revision of his Codebreakers book. Donald wrote about all the worldwide publicity that came from their solve, but they never went into much detail about how they solved it, since they thought that it would be too technical for the average person. He said he was tired of all the publicity, but would enjoy sharing a scholarly approach to the topic with Kahn. He admitted that he and his wife Betty were not professional or even amateur cryptographers. As a child, he had an interest in codes and had done a college paper on non-Shakespearean authorship of the plays. I assume that was about one of the various theories that someone other than Shakespeare wrote all his famous plays, and that some coded clues to the mysterious author might be in his writings. Donald also mentioned owning the book Secret and Urgent by Fletcher Pratt, a detail mentioned in Graysmith's book. Donald liked the book for its historical content since he was a history teacher. Amazingly, he said in the letter, "I had never worked a cipher until we tackled this one, and I don't believe my wife had ever seen one before." My assumption about Donald was that he had some experience breaking codes, like maybe some simple cryptograms he came across as a young boy, but apparently the 408 was his first cipher. That's pretty incredible then. He and Betty solved a serial killer cipher with no experience in code breaking. He went on to say that, unfortunately, Zodiac was still at large despite their solution, but that police felt their solution was a great clue about Zodiac's motives. Then he gave Kahn a brief summary of Zodiac's Bay Area crimes, and mentioned the 340 cipher, which he said wasn't broken yet due to the use of so many more symbols in a much shorter message. That was true, but luckily it wasn't so short that the extra unique symbols prevented us from solving it 50 years after Donald wrote his letter. He then wrote, "The FBI and top professional cryptologists of the US had no better luck than we did in finding sufficient patterns to begin decipherment." So that suggests that the Hardens did try to work on the 340, but were unable to make any progress. In the next part of his letter, Donald began explaining how they solved the 408. He and Betty first saw all 3 parts of the cipher in the Sunday, August 3rd, 1969 edition of the San Francisco Chronicle-Examiner. He said the ciphers were accompanied by a reproduction of the letters Zodiac mailed with them, threatening more killings if the ciphers were not published. I didn't see that letter with the August 3rd article, but I do see it in the next day's edition of the Examiner. Donald said he was intrigued by the cipher, and by the part of Zodiac's letter where he said, "When they do crack the code, they will have me." Donald felt it was worth trying to crack it because maybe they could help save some innocent lives. He explained that the cipher was in 3 parts, and there was no way to know where it started or ended. So they started counting up all the symbols. They quickly learned the cipher was not simple substitution because the symbol frequencies were not high enough. For example, the most common letter in English is E, which takes up almost 13% of all text. Zodiac's cipher is 408 characters, so we'd expect a symbol standing for E to show up around 50 times. But instead, the most common symbol is the backwards Q, and it only appears 16 times in the whole cipher. The Hardens found out later that it substitutes for M instead of E. The Hardens also noticed the cipher used not only the regular 26 letters of the alphabet, but a bunch of different symbols and backwards letters. That made them suspect Zodiac was trying to hide his message's letter frequencies by assigning more than one symbol to each plaintext letter. So they looked for repeating patterns in the ciphertext for clues and immediately noticed places where the same symbol repeated side by side, which might indicate a repeated letter. Here are the cipher patterns Donald drew in his letter to Kahn. Let's look at where they appear in the entire 408 ciphertext. Donald wrote that they assumed the filled-in square, half-filled square, and B symbols all stood for the same plaintext letter, and that they were likely to be a double letter. Then they assumed the triangle and P symbols stood for the same letter, since they kept showing up in the same spot near the double letter. They made a similar conclusion with the symbols / and A, that they stood for the same letter, since they are also showing up in the same place relative to the double letter. But Donald points out this almost broke their solve because it later turned out that / and A stood for completely different letters. They deduced from all this that they were looking at a 4-letter word ending in a double letter. This led Betty to suggest that the cipher author probably used the word kill more than once in the message. So they replaced the / and A with the letter K, the empty triangle and P with I, and these 2 squares and B with the letter L. Here's what those substitutions look like in the rest of the cipher. Donald said they looked at the beginning of one of the sections, and some assumptions led them to believe it began with "I like killing." Once they plugged that in, more patterns were revealed in the rest of the cipher. But then kill appeared too many times, so they thought the A symbol must stand for something other than the letter K. They replaced it with W instead, which seemed to work better. From that point on, they used trial and error to look for patterns and substitutions until they finally had the entire message. But the letter doesn't go into any of those details. I can only speculate on what they tried. Why don't we do a little experiment? Let's try to finish our own solution of the 408 just to see how tricky it might have been for the Hardens to do it. They started it out for us with their information about finding patterns and uncovering the partial message, "I like killing." Let's assume that we still don't know the order of the cipher sections, so let's just keep them in the order they were shown in the newspaper. Look at this part. It says kill, followed by E, an unknown letter, and will. It seems like there are only 2 possible words there, killer and killed. Let's say we picked killer, so this backwards F is R. There was another backwards F down here where it says killing WIL. But we picked R for it, so now it says killing WILRG. That looks like gibberish, so maybe we should have picked killed instead. So let's substitute the backwards F with D. So we have killed will here, and then in the other spot it now says killing wild. That's better. Now, killing wild what? Something starting with a G. We could fit a small word here, such as God, Guy, Gus, Gas, Girl, Gary, Gwen, Game, Gina. If we include the I, we can fit Garcia, Gabriel, Gloria. I feel like Game is a good pick because none of the names match known victims of Zodiac. It pairs well with wild too, evoking a hunting theme. So let's go ahead and plug in Game here. The next part that caught my eye is at the bottom here. Kill, me, then the letter I, then GGI. We have to figure out where the word breaks are. There's no spaces in the ciphertext. I can't find any whole words that match the entire pattern here. What about words ending in just these 4 letters? The I, this unknown letter, G, and G. Still can't find any viable words, except egg, which fits there. But I, egg, I? That doesn't make much sense. So it makes more sense that there's a word ending with this pattern, followed by a word starting with GI. Just about every word that ends with this pattern ends in ing. During, being, going, using, dying, etc. So let's go ahead and use N here. There's an interesting pattern over here. Plaintext I, then cipher symbol I, and another plaintext I. It repeats here as well. We can look at a list of the most common 3-letter patterns, or trigrams, in English. The most common one that starts and ends with I is this one, ITI. So I'll go ahead and guess T for this symbol. I don't know if the Hardens used trigram frequencies like this. It's a useful tool. I think they did use similar lists for bigrams, or 2-letter patterns, especially when it came to their double L breakthrough. Speaking of bigrams, look at this one. The cipher symbol's LM. It repeats 3 different times. So maybe it stands for a common bigram in English. In this list of the most common bigrams in English, the top 5 are TH, HE, IN, ER, and AN. If we try plugging them in, the resulting plaintexts look like these. The one that makes the most sense there is TH, so that looks like the best choice, so let's go with that. Now, back down here, it's starting to get more filled out. There's this missing letter, then HING, then GI. The only word I know that fits there is thing, so let's plug in the T. After kill, we have 2 unknown letters, then ME thing. What can we fit there? Something, same thing, come thing, and name thing. Out of those, something seems to make the most sense, so let's plug that in. Okay, what about this fragment? I will N, 2 unknown letters, then GI. Here are some phrases that fit that pattern. The only 2 that make sense are I will not give and I will now give. If we plug in now, this part turns into WIWH, but if we plug in not, it turns into the word WITH, which makes more sense. So let's keep not instead of now. Let's look again at the part the Hardens started us out with. I like killing. There's a sideways K symbol on the same line, and it shows up twice. So we can try to find a word that fits that pattern, where the first and 4th letters are the same, and the 3rd letter is O. If it's a longer word, then its 5th letter is L. Here's a list of some that match. People makes the most sense to me, so I'm going to plug that in. Back at the bottom, this part says LLT, then some letter, then kill something. There aren't any longer words that end in this pattern here, so it makes the most sense that the word to appears here. Let's plug that in. Okay, here it says killed will, and then this fragment. Some things that fit there are become, be some, and be home. They all involve be, so plug that in. Here it says I will not, then something starting with GI. It's probably a verb, so what verbs start with GI and fit in that space? The 2 that I can think of are give and gift. If we plug in gift, then this part turns into EFENBETTT, which looks like gibberish. But if we plug in give, then this part turns into even bet, which looks readable. So let's keep the word give. Then this part looks like it's obviously saying even better. The only things that fit here are than and twang. Twang doesn't make sense, so I picked than. Here we have with and girl, and it looks like a one-letter word is missing between them. The obvious choice is A, so it says with a girl. Here it says, I will be blank e-born in. Only thing that makes sense here to me is reborn. Then here before it says, killed will be, this clearly looks like the word have. This part says, I will not give name with a fragment in the middle. Notice the repeating empty square. Each of those must stand for the same letter. It's probably not a vowel since if you plug any of them in, it makes this first part not look right. A consonant makes more sense, but then the second part looks weird. But Y, which acts as a vowel and consonant, makes it look right. I will not give Y-O my name. Then the missing letter is obviously U. Okay, now check out the word pattern here after I will not give you my name. There's a very similar word pattern over here after I like killing people. Both of them have the same repeating bigram. The only word I can find that fits this first pattern is because, which makes sense in both places, so let's use that. Now this says, because it is something much. There's a two-letter word starting with S, so it pretty much has to be so. Now it looks like it says, better than getting your rocks. That backwards R symbol kind of gives it away. Over here it looks like it says, with a girl the best part. So plug in the E. In this section it says, my collecting something, slaves something, my something. Notice that the Q symbol repeats, so it's the same letter. And this J repeats, also the same letter. Just from looking at this, it's clear both symbols stand for F. So it says, my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. We can finish the rest of this pretty easily. It is so much fun, it is more fun than killing wild game. When I die, I will be reborn. And this looks like thrilling experience, even though it is misspelled. And there we have it, the entire plain text, despite a few misspelled words. In reality, there probably would have been more trial and error and backtracking when making the wrong guesses. You might take a different path yourself if you tried cracking the 408. It would be fun to find a code-breaking enthusiast who somehow doesn't already know the cipher solution, and then watch them try to break the cipher by hand. What strategies and choices would they make? What mistakes would they have to work around? Now that we have the entire message, it's pretty easy to put the sections in the correct order. These first two sections seem to start in the middle of sentences, but the last section starts out a whole sentence, so it probably goes first. Then the rest of it makes sense. The end of the first section combines with the start of the second section to read, to kill something gives me. Since the third section doesn't start with a complete sentence, it says, I have killed. It probably belongs here, and we have the correct order for all three sections. Donald wrote that cracking the code was harder because of Zodiac's poor spelling. For example, he misspelled forest, dangerous, animal, and experience. If that wasn't enough, Zodiac also wasn't consistent with some of his substitutions. His dotted triangle stood for both A and S, and his filled triangle stood for three different letters, A, I, and S. Here is the full Z408 plaintext that Donald put in his letter to David Kahn. He fixed the inconsistent substitutions but kept the misspellings. I like killing people because it is so much fun. It is more fun than killing wild game in the forest because man is the most dangerous animal of all. To kill something gives me the most thrilling experience. It is even better than getting your rocks off with a girl. The best part of it is that when I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and all thee I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name because you will try to slow down or stop my collecting of slaves for my afterlife. And then these 18 letters of gibberish. Donald pointed out the apparently missing word between sections 2 and 3, where it says, and all thee I have killed. It seems like there's a missing word there, such as people. But some of us have wondered if there is more than just a missing word. What if an entire line is missing? Maybe Zodiac was in a hurry when he wrote out his message and completely skipped over a line. What if it really said, "And all 13 wicked people I have killed," or "All the pretty girls you see I have killed"? Those are just my made-up examples, so don't take them too seriously. They just happen to fit on that line. Donald also pointed out the last 18 characters that don't make any sense. He thinks they were used as filler to balance out its section so it matches the same 8x17 dimensions of the other two sections. He wrote that Betty tried for weeks to extract a message from it by finding Zodiac's mistakes elsewhere in the cipher and applying them to the last 18. She didn't manage to extract a message this way. Donald then mentioned their extensive code-breaking effort, which took them the better part of 4 days. Because of the amount of energy it took, they were not eager to do it again. They were also very surprised that they were the first in the nation to arrive at the solution. He gave brief biographical information about him and Betty. They met and married in Florida. He taught in various schools in the US, but they settled in Salinas. He mentioned that cryptography isn't even one of his hobbies and prefers reading nonfiction. Donald ended the letter by acknowledging that Kahn was one of the few who could persuade him to share such a detailed account of their cipher solution. The second letter from the Hardens to Kahn was from a month later, March 8, 1970. Donald was responding to another letter Kahn had sent earlier, apparently requesting newspaper articles and information about the Zodiac case and ciphers. Donald enclosed some clippings and advised Kahn that since some articles may have errors regarding their story, he should refer to his previous letter, which described their solution in detail. Kahn apparently asked about the cipher stumping professional cryptographers. Donald explained that the 408 had been sent to the US Navy code experts before it was printed in the papers, and that it had been forwarded to the FBI, but neither had any success, and Donald said to contact Vallejo Police Department Sergeant John Lynch for more details. I don't know about the Navy, but I do know that the 408 was submitted to the FBI, but it didn't reach the codebreakers there until after the Hardens already cracked it. He then mentioned the 340 and how it stumped both the FBI and Dr. Marsh of the American Cryptogram Association. Their publication, The Cryptogram, featured the 408 cipher, but they didn't publish the plain text because they considered it to be too unsavory for their readers. Donald closed the letter with the hope that Kahn would send them a copy of the revised edition of the Codebreakers book if their story ended up in it. The original book was published in 1967. I checked my own copy of the book, which is the revision from 1996. I think that was the only revised version Kahn made, but unfortunately the Hardens story and the Zodiac ciphers do not appear in its pages. This is a great shame because their story is important enough to include in any historical account of cryptography. Since the first version was published back in 1967, people have wondered if Zodiac got some of his cryptography ideas from it before creating his ciphers. Robert Graysmith thought that he did, but I don't think there's any conclusive evidence to support that. Check the video description for a link to an article I wrote about this a while ago. Now, let's take a look at some of the items Donald Hardin mailed to David Kahn. The first is this reproduction of the cipher from an article. Donald wrote numbers along the side to correct the order of the 3 different sections. Looks like the article had the second and third sections swapped. The cipher image comes from a Zodiac article in the November 30th, 1969 edition of a tabloid paper called the National Tattler. Not only did they get his name wrong, calling him Donald Hardens instead of Hardin, but they don't even credit Betty by name. The next article he included appears to be from the Times-Picayune from February 7th, 1971. It was a lengthy piece about the Zodiac murders and gave only Donald credit for cracking the 408, leaving Betty out entirely. It also refers to the 18 undeciphered letters at the end, not as individual letters, but as 4 distinct undeciphered words. I don't believe the Hardens ever broke those letters up into words. In the letter to David Kahn, he shows all 18 letters as one undeciphered chunk. Donald also included this San Francisco Examiner article from August 10, 1969, which references Vallejo detective Sergeant John Lynch saying that the 408's decipherment was correct. It also mentions confirmation and praise from Dr. Marsh of the American Cryptogram Association. The headline suggests Donald was the sole solver, and only later in the article does it mention that Betty helped to break the code. And this article, too, breaks up the last 18 characters into chunks for some strange reason. The next article was Dave Smith's big piece from the LA Times, published October 15, 1969, a few days after Zodiac killed cab driver Paul Stein. Once again, the last 18 characters are broken up into 4 words for some reason. And the article quotes Sergeant John Lynch saying, "I think perhaps the man's name is in the cryptogram, possibly in the last 4 words." Donald's speculations about the killer are included in the article. He thought Zodiac was bright enough, but not necessarily of high intellect. And he might have been middle-aged because he used an old-fashioned slang term. The article said the term wasn't revealed by police, but I assume it was getting your rocks off with a girl. Another article Donald enclosed was from the front page of their local Salinas paper, The Californian. It included a photo of Donald and credited Betty by name for her help in breaking the code. It also quoted her saying that she had what she called a simple woman's intuition when she first saw the cipher, and at first she thought the cipher was the work of a crank. But then patterns leading to the phrase, "I like killing," convinced her that there was a real message in it. They spent a large part of 4 days laboring over the cipher until they broke it, using a lot of trial and error, and testing combinations backwards and forward. She said she had no doubt that whoever wrote the cipher was indeed responsible for the murders, and that the garbled part at the end made the writer look drunk or in a trance. Or maybe each symbol stood for a complete word. The article also repeated Donald's sentiment that he didn't consider himself a cryptographer, and not even an amateur cryptographer. He said he didn't even like doing recreational cryptograms because it seems like a lot of work for nothing. Oddly, the article included their home address at the end. Doesn't that seem like a bad idea? Especially since Zodiac was still quite active at that time. He hadn't yet attacked Brian and Cecilia at Lake Berryessa, or Paul Stine in San Francisco. The Hardens lived a few hours away from Zodiac's crime scenes, but the papers shouldn't have painted a target on the home of the people who solved his cipher. Another article Donald sent Kahn was from the November 12, 1969 edition of the San Francisco Chronicle. It included large portions of the letter the paper had recently received from Zodiac. This was also around when they received his 340 cipher, nearly a month after he killed Paul Stine. The article also included a rundown of the Zodiac case and a brief summary of the Hardens' solution of the 408 cipher. The last article Donald included wasn't shown with any additional information, but it appears to be a somewhat abridged reprint of the October 15, 1969 article written by Dave Smith of the LA Times. Here you can see where they marked the section that mentioned them. And that's it for the letters and the material that the Hardens sent to David Kahn. They solved Zodiac's first cipher when his murders were still ongoing. Less than 2 months after their solution, Zodiac struck again at Lake Berryessa, and then a month later in San Francisco. The solution did not yield Zodiac's identity despite his promise. That must have been frustrating for the Hardens, since they hoped breaking the code would advance the investigation. It was similar for us when we cracked the second cipher, the 340. Cracking that one, again, didn't yield a name or identity. And it was 51 years after he wrote it, long after he had committed his attacks and murders. We didn't feel that same sense of immediacy the Hardens must have felt when they were right in the midst of it, when the Zodiac was at the peak of his game and the Bay Area was under his spell of fear and notoriety. It's too bad we don't have David Kahn's side of these letters to get more of a sense of why he was communicating with the Hardens. Presumably it was to research information for a revised edition of the Codebreakers, but he never did publish the Zodiac cipher story in it. Why not? It was certainly historically significant. Was he just personally curious about the story? Or he just didn't ever get around to incorporating it in his book? The Hardens' achievement was impressive. They cracked the Zodiac's first cipher completely by hand over 4 days without any computers. I wonder how long it would have been for someone else to derive the solution if the Hardens hadn't done it first. I'm grateful to the National Cryptologic Museum and their librarian, Rob Simpson, for preserving and unearthing these glimpses into the minds of fellow citizen sleuth codebreakers. The letters are important pieces of history in the Zodiac case. Be sure to check out the National Cryptologic Museum in person if you get a chance. It's located only 2 blocks away from the NSA headquarters in Fort Meade. Many thanks also to cryptanalyst Bill Breyer, who alerted me to the existence of these letters, and for his numerous helpful contributions in the editing phase of the paper Sam Jarl and I wrote about our 340 solution. If you haven't seen that paper yet, check it out. The link's in the video description. It's a comprehensive telling of the story of the 340, the many attempts to solve it, and our eventual breakthrough. Thanks for watching, everyone. Please help out the channel by sharing the video, clicking like and subscribe, and please post your comments and questions. See you next time.